Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we still have folks rolling in, so we're going to give it another few minutes, and then we will get started right on time. So thank you all for waiting. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to the final session, in our 2022 Water Loss Webinar Series, Billing Data in Water Auditing. I imagine most of you are familiar by now, but my name is Avery Davis from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. And we have a few housekeeping items to cover, and then we will begin. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording, today's handouts, and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today as well as a handout in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has been pre-approved for continuing education credit only in the state of Indiana for water operators and validators. Attendees from other states are welcome to self-submit this training for credit, but we cannot guarantee it'll meet your PDH or CE requirements. It is your responsibility to check with your licensing agency to see what you need to do to receive credit for your attendance today. We will still provide certificates of attendance to eligible attendees for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire duration of the webinar. You must participate in polls and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent out via email within 30 days of the webinar date. And if you have any questions or need assistance, you can contact us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about the Environmental Finance Center Network. We provide training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, I would like to introduce our presenters for today. So we have James Markham and Don Nall, both research engineers from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico. So Don, James, welcome, and I'm going to pass everything over to you.
All right, if I can just get confirmation that everything looks like it's supposed to look, and then we'll jump in.
Good to go.
All right, so thank you all for attending. This is our last session in this water loss control webinar series. And if this is the first one you're attending, we encourage you to view the others that are available. The recordings are available on our website. So I am Dawn Null, and with me again today is James Markham. We are both research engineers at the Southwest DFC, where our mission statement is promoting self-reliance through innovative training and assistance focused on actionable results. As I said, this is the last session in our series, and the topic today is billing data in the water audit. Some of what we cover today will be reviewed from the prior sessions, but the point of today's session is to make sure that staff in the billing department, who may be a bit removed from the operations side of the utility business, really understand the water audit and what data points they're likely to be called upon to provide information for. So we want to make sure that different departments are using the same vocabulary. They're not accidentally miscommunicating what data needs to be provided for the audit and what's going to be done with it. To attend, remember, you have to attend the entire scheduled session and respond to all the poll questions to receive a certificate of attendance. And this image on the screen now is what we will use when there is a poll that's coming up, so be prepared for those. This session has been approved in Indiana for 1 water audit validator CEU and 1 hour of operator certification. You can self-submit your certificate for CEUs to your state authority, but we can't guarantee they'll be approved. So with that housekeeping out of the way, we're going to get started. We're going to start the session off with a brief review of water loss in general and the role of the water audit. And then we're going to move on to billing data and why billing staff really need to be an integral part of your water auditing process. In this series, we referred to water loss as a blue and green problem, in that there is water that isn't going where we want it to go, which is represented by the blue, and there's revenue that we're not making, but potentially we could be, which is represented by the green. The water audit helps address both the blue and green sides by quantifying and valuing non-revenue water. So first, we need to understand what non-revenue water means in the water audit context. So non-revenue water, or NRW, is water that goes out to the system that we don't get paid for. Non-revenue water falls into 3 general categories. So there's water we use or we give away on purpose in production or for sewer cleaning or for fighting fires or for authorized unbilled accounts. There's water that's consumed unbeknownst to us, whether that's via theft or via inaccurate metering or other types of errors. And then finally, there's water that leaks out of the system. It never makes it to a customer. These 3 categories are referred to in the audit as authorized unbilled consumption, apparent loss, and then finally real loss. So it's vital to understand that completely eliminating non-revenue water and your water loss is not a very realistic goal. You're likely to have some volume of non-revenue water. Some unbilled consumption may be unavoidable. Leaks and breaks are going to happen over time, and they will result in real loss. And there will always be some money left on the table due to metering inaccuracies and other types of errors. What you're trying to determine with the audit is the volume in each of those categories and its value, so that you can make decisions about how to address it going forward. Some losses you'll be able to reduce or recover economically. So in other words, you'll get the money back. The cost of that reduction will be returned to you, and then some. Some of the volume you could reduce uneconomically. So in other words, you might spend $1 to recover 90 cents. Meter changeouts can fall into this category, at least in the short term. And typically the incremental revenue increase you'll get from more accurate meters isn't going to pay for those new meters right away. The return on investment might be longer. So if you're looking short term, that might seem like an uneconomical solution. And some volume just isn't going to be reducible or recoverable at all, because nothing is ever perfect. People steal, errors get made, meters break, so on and so forth. So you're going to do the audit to understand your system's non-revenue water and loss profile so that you can develop processes that minimize the number of things that can go wrong and that you can catch them when they do go wrong. So for any situation, there's going to be a break-even point after which the remedy costs more than the problem, but that's going to be situation specific. And that's okay, because if you can quantify what's going on in your system, you can address it appropriately. So what we're generally looking for is economic loss levels, though what those are will vary from system to system and may also be impacted by state conservation requirements and loss standards. The goal is to really identify what's affordable to reduce. It's also important to understand that a water audit is just one part of a much larger water loss control program. And if you want more details on water loss programs, please watch the webinars earlier in this series. The ultimate goal should really be action. So when we complete the water audit and probably do other types of analysis, we learn about our non-revenue water and our water loss, and we can then begin to take actions to address them, which can save both water and revenue. So now let's talk about the water audit and why billing really needs to be an integral part of the water auditing process. So this review is going to be short. As I mentioned, the earlier webinars do go into much greater detail, and I really encourage you to watch them if you haven't yet. So AWWA has for many years provided a free Excel-based software that can be used to complete a water audit and can help you quantify both the blue and the green sides of your water loss problem. There are two versions of the water audit software currently in use. Version 5, which has been around for several years now, and version 6, which was released just a little bit over a year ago. So different states are adopting version 6 on different schedules. And although there are some differences, for the most part, for the purpose of today's talk, those differences are pretty minor. So what's shown on the screen right now is version 6, and you can see the sources and the categories of consumption that go into the audit on the left side of the screen in that blue text. But what it really boils down to is that the audit is fundamentally a water balance. So in other words, we're trying to balance the water system inputs on the left with consumption that we can track to get to the results on the right, which shows us what volumes of water are in each consumption category and which are making us money and which are not. So water balance, in equals out, right? So we start on the left with the system ins, the system inputs, and then we use data that we have from a variety of sources. The billing system is probably a major one of those sources, but hopefully it's not the only one that will help us account for all of the different consumption categories in our system. So when you use this water balance, you're basing it on the idea that all of the water that enters your system comes out somewhere. And although some source and consumption values may be estimates, particularly if you're new to auditing, you should be able to put values in all of the boxes in this water balance, except for one category, the real losses. Real losses are your leaks, and they're not very easy to measure. And so the real losses are calculated based on all the other numbers you input into the balance. It's what's left over after all of the consumption is subtracted from all of the system inputs. Each utility's billing system is set up differently, and many systems track some of the categories of consumption completely outside of the billing system. Some have production volumes in the same database, but the utility billing system is typically a source and sometimes the only source for consumption data in many of these boxes. Even when the billing system isn't a direct source for data, it will often be used to help derive the data. So for example, our billed unmetered customer consumption might be estimated by starting with the number of unmetered billed accounts in the system. Part of the systematic data handling errors volume may be defined by a review of your billing practices and procedures and the errors that have been uncovered and fixed over the years. And the billing database might also be a repository for other relevant information, like flagged instances of theft or meter accuracy results, so on and so forth. So it's critical to get the best possible consumption data for the water audit, because consumption errors can have a significant impact on the audit results. So if you're overestimating your consumption, you artificially reduce the volume of real loss in the audit. It's like looking through these rose-colored glasses here. It gives you a cheery view, but of course, that's just on paper. It doesn't change what's happening in the distribution system. And having an incorrect view of the magnitude, sources, and types of losses can point you to the wrong solution. Then on the other hand, if you underestimate your consumption without making any other changes, the underestimated volumes show up in the real loss category, which makes things look worse. And that in turn might result in unnecessary worry and poorly focused action and spending money in the wrong places. So billing needs a seat at the audit table, because billing is a source of most of the consumption data by volume. We stress that auditing and water loss control in general is best approached as a team endeavor. In most systems, authorized consumption, whether it's billed or not, is going to constitute the majority of the volume, and most of that information is either in the billing system or needs to be corroborated by the billing system or derived with the billing system data. So you might, for example, have a SCADA system tracking everything, including consumption. But even if you do, you're going to want to compare that to your billing data. As I said, the billing system setups vary, so it's vital to understand for your particular system who is collecting what source and consumption data, how is that data being tracked, how is it stored, how is it amended or corrected, who can retrieve it, how is it retrieved, and who uses it for what. And while this may seem like a minor point, it can have significant consequences. We worked with a system a year ago that used raw customer meter read data for two purposes: for billing and by the Conservation Department for their state water consumption reporting. But because of a reporting timing issue, the Conservation Department got the raw meter data and filed their reports before the reads were fixed, whether there was a dropped read or maybe we missed it, or there was a reason that a dog was chasing us down the road. So before those got fixed, or any of the other myriad data correction procedures that billing had in place happened. And on top of that, we found some additional Conservation Department cleanup was actually making the data even less accurate. But at this system, despite the fact that the billing consumption data was much more accurate than the Conservation Department data, auditing was viewed as a conservation issue. It was handed to the Conservation Department, and the more accurate billing data was ignored, at least until we started asking some questions. So what we're saying here is that your billing department, you folks in billing, you're often a linchpin for a good audit. Further, billing processes and procedures may be a significant part of the solution to a water loss issue as well. So it's important to have billing at the table to develop good audit data, to develop practices and procedures that will help you identify and address your losses in the long term. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to James so he can talk to you a bit more about the data that you're going to use from billing and put it in the audit and dig a little bit deeper. So James, feel free to take it away.
All right, wait for my computer to catch up here. Thank you, Don. So I think that introduction shows pretty clearly that billing data is kind of important for an audit, and having billing staff participate is also very important. As we dig into the individual billing data points that you might be called on to provide, I want to start this section off with a couple of general observations. And the first is that billing system and data handling practices really vary a lot from system to system. And we're not saying today that the billing department has to be responsible for all of the data points that we're going to be discussing. We're not trying to make extra work for anybody, but we do want you to know what these data points are so that the audit team can work out which individuals and departments it makes the most sense to have track and compile these various volumes or parts of volumes for the audit. Second, a lot of the data that gets used for the audit and other water loss control purposes isn't necessarily designed for water loss control, and billing data falls squarely into that category. Billing software functions are converting readings into bills, sending that bills, and indicating that money's been collected for those bills. Most billing systems count water consumption to develop a bill or part of it, assuming you've got a volumetric component to your bill, but they're not necessarily set up to identify losses. So it's critical to understand the processes that are going on inside the billing system and any other software that you use to query it so that you can extract good data. It's really important also to understand how your business processes might impact the consumption and other data stored in your billing system, because the billing system, as Don said, is going to be a source for a lot of different kinds of valuable information. And last, and somewhat related to my last point, is the fact that there is often a difference between source and summary data because of compiling errors and other errors that can be inadvertently introduced into billing data. A key to getting good audit results is making sure that the source data and the summary data match. In other words, that the summary number you come up with for any given data point actually matches the sum of the individual source data points that should be going into it, because there may be a difference. In a prior session, I mentioned a system that had a faulty database query for extracting archived customer data. Their query was set up wrong and it pulled the exact same volume for every archived customer. And because those results were sort of buried in a summary consumption report as a single line, and that total volume was only viewed as a summary value, that error went undetected for a really long time. That resulted in under-registered consumption, and that in turn gave the impression that real losses was higher than it actually was. So some things to think about as we're going through these individual data points. So those are sort of general observations. Now let's switch gears and talk about some of the data points that billing is either going to be the main source or an ancillary source of data for, and discuss issues to be on the lookout for as you develop data. But before we do that, we've got our first poll question, and this is just sort of an audience question to see who's actually watching now. So it's real simple. We're gonna give you about 30 seconds to answer. The question is, do you work in the billing department? Yes or no, or not applicable, I don't work at a utility. So I'll give you a chance to answer those.
Okay, I'm
Right,
going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1.
All right, so it looks like we got about 21% saying yes, 43% saying no, and 36% not working at a utility. So for those of you who are working in the billing department, this whole presentation is focused squarely at you. For those of you who don't, hopefully some of the information that we're going over will help you in your conversations with systems that are auditing, or help you with that conversation that you have with your billing team. So with that, let's get into some of the volumes. And oddly enough, I'm going to start with production volume because that is something that may or may not be under billing's purview. In the audit, we've got a couple of different potential sources for production volumes, volume from our own sources, whether that's surface water or groundwater, or imports. These values sometimes get tracked in the same database as consumption data. I've seen setups where there were different classes of customer accounts set up for wells and import meters and booster pumps and district meters and customer meters, and all of those were read on the same meter routes. If that kind of situation exists in your system, you have to be able to segregate that production and intermediate flow data from the rest of the consumption data. And you also have to be sure that you have everything, that the read data that you use matches the physical audit boundaries, that you're not double counting or leaving volumes out accidentally. And we've seen all of that happen. Particularly with imports, you really want to make sure you know how you're getting your consumption data. Is that your staff reading a meter? Are you getting consumption data or volume data from your supplier? Maybe both of those things are happening. It's really important to know, whose meter's being read on what schedule, how it's being maintained, what its accuracy is, and what if any adjustments have been made to the recorded and compiled volumes, either the ones that you're getting from your supplier or the ones that you are compiling internally. You might be getting import volumes on a daily basis, but getting billed in February for January consumption. And again, your billing department may or may not interact with or see this type of data, but if it does, understanding that data flow is really, really important. Also, I want you to keep in mind that some of our later discussion is going to be talking about metering and adjustments that have to be made to various volumes. If your billing department deals with source volumes, recognize that those adjustments and talking points apply just as well to production volumes. Moving on to the things that billing systems are typically called on for, which is the consumption side of things. And as Don said, this is typically going to come out of your billing system or at least be corroborated by your billing system. The water audit has essentially 4 categories of authorized consumption. They all show up in one place. We've got billed metered consumption, we've got billed unmetered consumption, we've got unbilled metered consumption, and last but not least, we've got unbilled unmetered consumption. The first thing to note is that there's only a single field for each of these categories, which means somebody has to compile the data, and that can be a significant chore. Another thing to note is that the unbilled unmetered category is in yellow. If you haven't worked with the audit before, yellow fields indicate something that the audit is calculating for you rather than being input. Although with this particular data point, you can either have the audit do the calculation for you, or you can, as is the case here, input a value for that category. This is typically compiled from a lot of different sources, both inside and outside of the utility. Typically, billing is going to get called on for the billed metered and the unbilled metered, but it could include partial information, providing partial information for the other 2 categories as well, depending on how you run your business and who's responsible for tracking what. As Don said, the unbilled unmetered consumption estimates are typically going to start with the number of accounts of that type in a billing system, and that would then be supplemented with information about occupancy patterns, household size, per capita consumption in your area. Billing might not pull all of that information together, but they're going to be responsible for part of it. So let's dig into these categories a little bit more deeply. Billed metered consumption. As Don said, this is typically going to make up the bulk of the consumption in a metered system. Think about all the different classes and tiers of paying customers you have. Think about archive volumes if your system archives dormant or transferred accounts during an audit period. Think about new service and shutoffs. What mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that set meters are actually added to the billing system promptly, and that shutoff meters aren't being turned off without your knowledge? If you have portable meters, for example, that are rented out and used by construction crews, how are those being read? Are they read routinely, or do you only read them when the meter is returned? Because you could have significant consumption on one of those meters that's maybe not flagged during the year if somebody returns it to you after the end of the year. Do you have customers that have odd billing cycles? It's unusual, but you might have somebody that's on a quarterly cycle when everybody else is on monthly. What happens with broken meters? Things like this are the kinds of questions you have to consider to make sure that you're capturing all of the consumption. Unbilled metered consumption can actually be fairly significant. Typically, this is things like municipal buildings and parks, other facilities or specific accounts where the utility has purposely decided to give water away. And a lot of times these types of accounts are sort of put out of sight and out of mind. So think about whether they are being read and monitored like your billed accounts. Are they being read monthly with everyone else? Are those accounts run through the same procedures that the paying accounts are to find errors? For example, slow and stop meter reports. Do those accounts show up on those, and are they dealt with promptly like paying accounts? Or are they simply ignored because there's not really any money associated with the volumes that are being consumed? And these volumes could be significant if you think about it. If you're talking about watering a major park over the course of a year, or maybe a city pool or something like that, that could be a substantial amount of water. And you really need to be tracking these unbilled accounts the same way you track billed accounts, because you need to know on an ongoing basis what you're giving away for free. And again, those accounts and meters are subject to problems and leaks just like everybody else. So if you're not watching them, you might be losing a lot more volume than you think you are. Billed unmetered consumption might be in your purview. If you've got a flat rate tier system, as I said, you might be responsible for providing some of the data to build those estimates. But think about your system. If you're a billed metered system, are there any places where you actually don't send out a bill but don't read a meter? or are there accounts that effectively fall into this category even though they're technically metered because the meter's been broken forever and you don't actually read it? Like maybe you've got a school that has a flat rate but also a broken meter, or maybe you have fire connections that don't have a meter but just have a trip switch that lets you know when it's been activated. Maybe a user gets charged a flat fee for fire consumption. How do you estimate how much consumption has happened there? So think about those things. And again, as a billing department, you might have access to some of this information or none of it. The unbilled, unmetered consumption is typically the least likely to be in billing's purview, although you may have insight into some of this category of consumption because it typically comes from a lot of different sources, some of which are going to be, production inside the utility, but might also be outside the utility, the streets department, sewers, for example. But this information might be reported to the billing department and maybe kept separately, even if it's not in the actual billing system. Maybe there's a separate spreadsheet that you keep, and maybe your organization decides that billing is a good place for that to be. If you're not tracking this kind of consumption, you might want to think about it. There's a default value you can use, but it's a one-size-fits-all, and it might not be appropriate for you. So think about that conversation and whether the billing department might be a good central repository for gathering that kind of information from the various inside and outside users of unmetered consumption. Exports can also be significant in terms of consumption. And one of the weird quirks of the audit is that exports are actually addressed in the water supplied part of the audit, along with the volume from owned services and imports. But I'm talking about them here because they represent sales and consumption. And because those are typically customers that are set up in the billing system, even though they might be set up as a separate class of customer. The definition of exports is water going to another system through a permanent connection. This could be a seasonal use or year-round use. But as a practical matter, you have to be able to, again, segregate this kind of use from your regular customers when you compile your consumption data. You might have a separate class set up for these to make it easy to report on. If you don't, you need to be able to go through and find them. And we've worked with large utilities that have sort of smallish export customers that are just set up like a regular business. But for audit purposes, you really want to be able to segregate those if they're mixed in with everybody else. Again, just to make sure you're not double counting or missing anything. So that's the basic consumption side data points that you're going to be called on potentially to look at. But every one of those has a potential for adjustments. There's adjustments that are going to be made by billing as part of regular business practice, and there may be other adjustments that have to be made sort of after the fact, and billing departments might be the storehouse for that data, or might be involved in triggering that kind of adjustment that's being made. And this is really, again, why it's really important for the billing staff to be on the audit team. Your billing clerks probably have the best understanding of sort of the daily billing operations and how the billing software actually works than anybody else in the system. They might be the ones who can tell you, what data is available, what format it's available in, because that's kind of critical as well. Effectively, what's going on under the billing system's, proverbial hood. And it's also about dialogue, because as Don pointed out, you want the billing staff to understand how what they do impacts the audit and the water loss program, and have that conversation with the operations side, because again, billing is likely to be a significant part of any solution that you come up with for dealing with loss problems that are going to be inevitably uncovered. A typical kind of adjustment that has to be made is prorating the consumption and production, if that's on your side of the data points that you're pulling together. The audit is a 360-day snapshot. It's 1 year. It might be a fiscal year or it might be a calendar year, but it's pretty typical to have billing systems that are not set up to match the calendar year exactly. You might even have multiple read routes on different days of the week, so your consumption information gets staggered over the beginning and the end of the year. And if that's the case, you have to prorate the consumption to match the audit timeframe, whatever that is. And this can be, again, really complicated if you've got a lot of staggered meter routes, but it's important. We've seen systems using 360 days of supply and 366 days of consumption, because that's just how their meter reads fell. And that kind of error is going to give you a really skewed and inaccurate picture of what's going on. You have to think about how credits work in your system. particularly leak credits, and both, not only that, how they're intended to work in the system and how they're actually completed, because again, there might be a difference between theory and practice. If your system creates a monetary credit by adjusting consumption values, or your workaround is to modify volumes because staff can't figure out how to do it on just the financial side, you have to have some way of tracking those volumes that get removed from the system to get that financial credit. Otherwise, they effectively disappear from the consumption record, and you definitely don't want that happening. Billing is also typically in charge of setting up new customers in the billing system and might be responsible for doing periodic reviews or audits of customer data or billing data to find mistakes. Or you might have an outside group that does this, or both. If you find mistakes, you need to have a mechanism in place for tracking the consumption volumes that those kinds of errors produce. For example, we worked with a system a few years ago. They had a big commercial customer with a large meter, and it was set up in the billing system incorrectly. They had the wrong conversion factors, so they got charged for 1 gallon out of every 100 they used. Finding and correcting that error fixed the issue going forward, but staff also had to back calculate the actual volumes that were consumed by that customer for the audit period. And not because they wanted to bill them, but because they needed to know what was actually consumed. Because again, if you can't account for it, it shows up in the real loss side of things. For a small residential customer, this kind of error might be inconsequential, but for some larger customers, it might not be. We also recently talked to a system that replaced registers on some large bore meters. This was an operational activity, but they read differently, and that ended up resulting in incorrect volumes in those customers. So think about error tracking, interdepartmental communication, so that the errors get found, get fixed going forward, but you don't lose track of the volumes that are associated with them. Think about your reading process, how your system handles missed reads, both from a monthly data collection perspective and as a matter of ongoing procedure. Does your system quickly reread missed meters in the same cycle? Or do you do estimated billing? Or do you simply wait for the following month to catch up? Think about how many accounts in your system might be estimated and how often those estimates are reconciled. If you've got a high number of estimated accounts, you might be really off in terms of actual consumption for those kinds of accounts. And I know that happens for a fact because it actually happened in my house. The utility was underestimating what I was using for quite a long period of time. They eventually caught up, but it took a couple of months. All of this is about understanding the data handling procedures. And most of the categories of error that we've been talking about sort of fall into the class of systematic data handling errors. And although the audit, again, provides an easy out in that there is a default value you can use to estimate those, it's really worth spending time digging into this area, even though it might not necessarily include large volumes, because again, that review lets you investigate how your system works or should work. There are a lot of different kinds of errors that can be made. There's meter reading errors, whether that's incorrect reads, corrupted data, drop data, meters that are entirely missing from the system altogether. There's issues with a billing system that can happen, either quirks that are built in or because of workarounds that have been developed, or improperly set up customer accounts. Management reports and archive data reports can be set up incorrectly, like the example I mentioned before. And then the policies and procedures themselves can actually lead to consumption being missed. And again, these are often the hardest to find because they require some in-depth research into systems and processes. And sometimes you're not just looking at the billing software, sometimes you're actually looking at hardware. So you might have to work with the operation side of things. But it's really important to do. These kinds of issues are obviously system specific. They're going to be different in different systems, but the point is you really need to understand your system's data handling and storage infrastructure, as well as those policies and procedures to make sure that the billing functions the way you think it does. And you find these kinds of errors by doing billing system audits and process audits. And again, once you find errors, make sure that you can track them. An important part of the audit process is doing the investigation and charting out processes to find gaps. As a business, you've got to know how your systems work. You want to document that information for daily operations, also for the audit and water loss control purposes, but possibly even more importantly for legacy purposes, so that the next billing clerk that comes in doesn't have to figure out the process for themselves and make it all up. There are quite a few other adjustments that you might be involved in. And again, this is all going to kind of depend on how information gets stored in your system and who tracks what pieces of information. Metering and accuracy is a big part of audit adjustments. Every supply and consumption data point in the audit has a corresponding meter inaccuracy adjustment field. So one question to ask is, does your system have test data? And if so, where is it kept? Does your utility actually track meter accuracy in the billing system, or do they think they do? And there are many billing systems that have fields for this. Typically, meters get tested at a mid, a low, and a high flow range, and then a composite flow-weighted error is calculated from that data. The calculation protocol is different for different classes of sizes of meters, but that's typically how it's done. We've run across billing systems that have a meter accuracy field, and sometimes it's populated with that composite error value, and also lets you know, when the test was done and why it was done, because those are important pieces of information. Other times it isn't, or maybe the information that is put in that field isn't interpreted correctly. So for example, I've seen systems where they have a pass-fail inspection. So they want their meters to read within plus or minus 2% accuracy, and as long as they do that, they pass. I've also seen systems like that that mark meters that pass as 100% accurate when they're not. They could be 98%, it could be 102% accurate and still have passed. So that's what I mean about having the information be interpreted correctly, understand what's being tracked and how it should be read. Even if another department is tracking meter accuracy, oftentimes this is the metering or operation side of things, correctly deriving meter adjustment values requires flow-weighted averages, because you need to know how much water is going through which size and type of meter so that you can apply the appropriate accuracy level and calculate, again, a flow-weighted composite error value for each of those inputs. So, you might have large bore commercial meters that have an average of 1% underread, while maybe your residential meters have an average underread of 3%. To calculate the final adjustment, whoever's going to do that needs to know how much water's gone through each of those respective types of meters. So billing might be called on to come up with residential volumes of consumption, commercial volumes that have been consumed, so that can be figured out. And again, your billing system may not have enough information in it to do that, but it might. You might also be called upon to, as I said, track untracked volumes that result from bad meters or stop meters by comparing year over year or month over month consumption reports, so that you can fill in those blanks with solid estimates. Billing also might be responsible for tracking theft, which the audit sort of benignly calls unauthorized consumption. It's important to realize there's a lot of ways to steal water, and billing is probably not set up to track all of them, but it might be set up to track some of them. There may be a field that you can mark for illegally bypassed or active meters. Theft from hydrants, billing is probably not set up to track, at least not the billing system. Although, again, you might have some other mechanism that where that information gets reported to billing. Of course, this is a situation differs kind of issue, and most systems tend to think theft isn't really a big issue, but a lot of systems don't track it either. So at a bare minimum, think about figuring out ways to document at least known instances of theft, so that your review and understanding of that problem isn't anecdotal. You want to be thinking about the kinds of theft that might be happening in your system and track them year over year to see whether anything needs to be done about it. So that's kind of most of the types of information that you're going to be talking about and adjusting on a volume basis. And I want to talk for a short bit about values because they're kind of important. Even though the volumes associated with metering errors and theft tend to be small, they actually add up to quite a lot because of the way we apply cost to different kinds of losses. So this picture is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it does make a point. Real losses get valued at the variable production cost. In other words, what it costs you to treat the water, and that's typically relatively low for a unit of water. And that makes sense because pipes leak a little bit, so you got to keep them full. It's basically a cost of doing business. Apparent losses, like most of the kinds of things we've been talking about, metering inaccuracy, theft, data errors that result in you not getting paid, are lost revenue. It's that green side. The customer got the water, you just didn't get paid. So when you're thinking about losses in your system, for apparent losses, you're looking at retail value. They're always viewed that way. And it's because of that difference in valuation that small amounts of apparent loss can have really big dollar impacts, and which is, again, why it's important to be looking for those as part of your sort of daily and annual auditing practices. this graph here kind of shows this in pretty clear terms. On the left-hand side, you've got the volumes of non-revenue water associated with this particular audit, and on the right-hand side, you've got the revenue. And if you look at the apparent loss side of things, so what we're looking at here is theft, customer metering inaccuracies, and systematic data handling errors. It's about a fifth, maybe a quarter-ish of the volume of real loss. But when you look at the right-hand column and you look at the value associated with that, you can see that that small bit of water is worth in dollar terms as much as all of the real loss combined. So this is why this sort of thing is really important. This is, again, why the billing department is critical for this kind of review and process, because you know, apparent losses are all about the Benjamins, as some might say. It's all about that green side, and fixing apparent loss issues can actually put money back on the table. That was version 5. In version 6, the diagrams look a little bit different. This is the dashboard in version 6, but you can see same sort of thing. We've got a small volume of water over here that is a large volume or a large amount of money. So again, this is critical. The reason we're showing this is to make that point that apparent loss volumes are worth a lot, and so you want to be able to track these down. There's one last category of information that a billing department often gets called on to help with, and that's some infrastructure information about the number of connections that there are in the system. Active and inactive connections is a data point in the audits. Getting this number is really important because that's what the metrics are based on. And so you have to think about in your system, who is responsible for this number? Is it the billing system? Is it ops? You know, do you track meters in your GIS system? Ideally, if you've got both of those information, you want both parties involved in this. But again, whether you're going to be called on to provide this directly is going to depend on what data you have. But even if the GIS department is giving a list of metered accounts, you're probably going to want to corroborate that with billing data. The audit essentially counts service connections to mains, whether a customer is on the end of it is active or not. So if billing is providing or helping confirm this number, it's really important to understand that system connections doesn't necessarily equal active accounts in the billing system. It might, but it might not. So you've got the active connections, and this is the number that billing typically comes back for when asked for connection data. You know, how many customers did I average last year? That's part of the total, but it might not be the whole total, particularly if you're perhaps a rural system or you're a system where there's a lot of construction going on. You know, is the process in your system for setting meters and getting them in the billing software seamless? You know, are there active connections out there that you don't even know about? And we've run into that on more than one occasion. Think about the inactive connections. You know, you might have even pulled the meters at some places because the house is abandoned or the building is abandoned. If the service line is still there, even if the property is abandoned, it still counts as a connection. It's inactive because it's essentially a hole in your mains with a service line that has a potential to leak, and any leaks that happen on that accrue to the customer. We see this a lot in New Mexico with smaller systems where a water system gets built in a town, and some people have their own wells. So they don't hook up right away, but they get the meter risers installed so that they can hook up one day. That counts as a connection. You know, there's no meter there, but there's a hole in the main and a service line associated with it. So you've got to include those unused or inactive meter presets. And you might actually have some fire connections that you need to include in this category. You know, you may have a fire service that's separate from a regular service line. We see this, you know, where fire connections maybe aren't metered, but simply have, you know, a trip alarm that lets you know that they've been triggered. They're not directly in the billing system, so they get missed. I want to note that this value does not include fire hydrants. Those are accounted for in another data point. But fire connections might be. And we actually worked with a system in Arizona that, as they were reviewing their information, realized that they had thousands of these connections in their town that they needed to investigate to determine sort of, you know, how big they were, what size lines there were, and whether they need to be counted in this category. Why is this all important? Well, again, it's because of the metrics primarily. The currently accepted metrics and endorsed metrics for water loss are all about connections per year and connections per day. So the volumetric losses are in gallons per connection per day, and the cost rates are in dollars per connection per year. So if you want to have accurate metrics and be able to judge, how you're doing compared to the existing audit data sets out there and how you're comparing to how you did the prior year, it's really important to have a solid connection count. And also because, lost and untracked connections often turn into sort of an out of sight, out of mind. And again, we've seen systems pull out active customers and not include those unbilled customers, for example. So you have to make sure that you're accounting for everybody. And although this might seem fairly simple, even with sophisticated systems, we often find that the connection counts are off. We did a field inventory for a system in a high growth area and found that 3% of the active meters out in the field were not actually in their billing system. And in some cases, there was actually no record of them being installed because it was a combination of city work and developers putting things in. And so, meters were getting turned on and service was being established, at least from the customer side, well before any of this showed up in the billing side of things. That was a big chunk of revenue lost because of poor business practices. And that screwed up their metrics. And we've seen similar situations in areas where housing is being abandoned without services, but there's still connections there where the metrics are off and losses seem higher than they are because you're not counting all of the connections. So if you're in an area that's got a lot of construction going on, or maybe population is moving out, make sure that those counts are correct. So one more poll question here. We've gone through a lot of information, and I realize this is quite dense and coming at you pretty fast. I encourage you to watch the earlier videos for some greater explanation on this. But this is a quick poll on how involved your billing system is right now. So we'll leave this open for another 10 or 15 seconds. Looks like we got about half of our votes there. Give you a few more times, see if we can get it up above 80, 85%. All right, looks like things are slowing down. Remember, if you want to get a certificate for this to submit to your agency, make sure you answer this question just so that we have it on record. And I guess if you're not sure, you can pick the last one. I just realized I didn't include a don't know. So use we don't currently conduct audits, or not a system for the I don't know. All right, looks like we've kind of stalled out on responses. So why don't we go ahead and close that poll? Cool. Well, those results are encouraging. That we've got the vast majority in somewhat involved or more. For those of you who currently are in the not involved at all category, hopefully some of what we've talked about today will help change your mind or help you start having that conversation with your billing department and getting them involved. The last thing I want to talk about today is documenting processes. We've talked about a lot of the different kinds of information you might be called on to provide, things that you might have to adjust. One of the main goals with an audit is A, to get accurate data, but B, to make it repeatable. You want your audits to be consistent over time so that you are understanding and getting a good view of how the solutions you're coming up with for your water loss problems are being impacted in the real world. Are the actions you're taking reducing loss of one kind or another? We want them to be consistent. We want another person to be able to recreate the audits from the data that you have. We want to understand the questions you have about the volumes and values that you calculate, because there may be open issues that you're not sure about. We want to be able to track those changes in methodology and their impact from year to year. So the audit itself has note and comment fields for each of these data points that you can put that information into. But if you are compiling a data for an audit, make sure you document your process so that you can explain to the people who are taking that data and running with it exactly how you got to where you got, and so the next person does it the same way. You also obviously want to document this business processes for legacy purposes. Flow charting your processes to make sure that they make sense, and developing written SOPs so that knowledge doesn't walk out the door with staff over turnovers is really important, both for auditing and just general billing practices. You want to understand how your billing system works. How does the data get from meter reads to consumption data? You may have hundreds or thousands of accounts, and that allows for a lot of mistakes to potentially be easily overlooked. If you understand how the data is supposed to be flowing, it makes it a lot easier to find those errors. There can be errors in data collection and transfer and billing and archiving and reporting processes, all of which can end up as mistakes in summary data, which will then mess up your audit results. And recognize that you may have multiple processes that cover the same kind of thing. So if you're a system that has some manual reads and some automatic reads, you might have a simpler process like this for automatic meter reading because it's mostly automated, but your manual process might be much more convoluted and look like something like this. So you want to make sure that you're charting all of those pieces and then look at it with a critical eye. Again, this is what the audit is really good for. It gives you a chance to evaluate what you're doing, why you're doing it, whether you can be doing it better. Think about, are your policies rational? Are they consistent? Are they codified and well communicated? If things aren't written down, write them down. Written policies are important. And having policies set up to ensure that metering is consistent, billing is consistent, that errors are caught and tracked is really critical. And you want to make sure that the actual practices that your staff engage in across the board, I'm not just talking about billing, actually reflect the mandated procedures that you've set up. So are the meter readers and the billing clerks and folks out there properly following policies and procedures. Again, it's all about understanding your data. There's probably a lot that you can do with the existing processes and existing data, but the audit is an ongoing process, and what you're looking for is incremental improvement. So, look at things with a jaundiced eye or a skeptical eye when you are sure that you've got it right. Move on to the next thing, but always come back and verify that things are working the way you think they are. Make sure you understand where your data is coming from, what the sources are, how those things may change over time. And again, this is not just for auditing purposes. It's really important for legacy. Main way you can do this is create a system guidance document and SOPs. In the handout section, we've got a draft or a template that you can use for working out your audit procedures. And I highly suggest that you look at that. You're probably wondering why I have a picture of a motorcycle engine here when we're talking about water. And it's because of the example I have about staff turnover and knowledge walking out the door. I restore British bikes back in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of consolidation of the British motorcycle industry, and a lot of people retired and equipment was moved from plant to plant. And with one particular company that will remain unnamed, when they got the stuff to the new plant and the new staff were trying to bore cylinders, they weren't coming out straight and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And they were spending a lot of money on bad cylinder castings because they weren't boring them out correctly. So somebody had the bright idea, let's find the guy who used to do this and bring him back and see if he can figure out what's going on. And the first question he asked when he walked in is, where's the stick? Because the machine they used for boring out the cylinders had bad bearings, and he used a wooden lever to compensate for the slop. Probably not the best way to do it, but he had a functional workaround, but that knowledge wasn't passed on. So the business wasn't able to benefit from that. This is the kind of thing that you want to avoid happening in your utility. If there's a way to get good billing data out of your billing system, you want to document that and make sure that the next person who comes to your utility can do that. So develop that accountability. Billing system should be part of that team so that we know who's doing what, who's tracking what, who's going to compile what data, so that you can do this as a smooth annual process and get good results. As I said, that handout is in the handout section. It's based on version 6 of the audit, but it's easily adaptable to version 5. The document summarizes a lot of the things that we've talked about today, and it's a great jumping off point for that internal conversation that you should be having about why you do audits, who has access to what data, who's responsible for compiling what data points, the formats that data is going to be in, and the timing for providing that. It's really important to have that internal conversation so that you can get the best data possible, and so that as a team, you can come up with the best solutions for the water loss issues that you uncover through auditing and other analysis. So that is the end of our formal presentation. Thank you for sticking with us through this entire webinar series. The whole thing is available on our website. This recording for today will be up within a couple of days. So if you have staff that you want to dig into this further, or you want to review some of the earlier webinars, those are available to you. I want to remind you that there is free technical assistance that's available as part of the EPA grant that this webinar series is presented under. Our contact information is going to be thrown up here in just a second when we get to the Q&A. We'll switch over now. If anybody's got any questions, please type them into the question field. We'll hang on for a couple of minutes. I know we're pretty close to time, but if there are questions that last a little bit longer, we're happy to hang out and talk you through them. Here is our contact information. If you have questions afterwards or are interested in getting some help with any of the issues we've talked about today or in our other 6 webinars, or you've got questions about asset management or drought resources and things like that, the EFC network is wide and has a lot of different skill sets, and we're here to help small systems at no charge. You know, we're your tax dollars at work. So please reach out to us if you've got any questions. And with that, I will end the formal part of the presentation. Dawn, do we have any questions yet?
Not at the moment. I do see that Samantha has her hand up and has had for a while. So Samantha, if you have a question, probably the best way for us to address it is for you to type into the question box. And if not, I understand. Sometimes we click buttons we don't mean to.
Or you can email us too. Thank you, Mark. We just I enjoyed the presentation. Let's see. Lots of thank yous, which we appreciate. Don't know that we have any questions. We'll leave it open for another minute or two. If you don't have any questions, you're welcome to log off now. Again, we thank you for attending. It's been really fun, and you know,
Hey James, we do have a question about where the recording can be viewed, and it was chat at the beginning of the session, the link to the YouTube channel, but it's also available on our website if you missed the chat, and maybe Avery, you could chat it out again if necessary.
Right, you'll be able to find this recording on our website. It's actually gonna be in multiple places. So on the contact sheet down there, you can see the swefc.unm.edu. This series is part of our featured projects on our website. It's on our YouTube channel. And if you've attended here, if I believe correctly, you'll get a notification with a link to the webinar after it's posted. Is that right, Avery?
That is correct. So all attendees from today will automatically receive the recording directly from GoToWebinar in their automatic follow-up email. We've also posted on the EFC and YouTube channel, which I shared at the chat just now. And we will be emailing it to you likely within a couple of days after the webinar as well. So we'll make sure you get the recording and all of the handouts from today.
And there is a good question. And so I want to make sure we touch on that. But before we address that question, Avery, if you have a chance to answer Melissa's question in the question box, I'd appreciate that about getting credit. But the question that came in is there a good way to account for vacant properties that are active but have little to no water use? Are these connections for the metrics?
So I'll answer the second half first. Yes, those are definitely connections. Basically, anything that's got a service line that's pressurized is an active connection. You know, if for some reason you were to rip out the service line and put a clamp over the main, it wouldn't count. But if it's out there going out to the curb stop, that counts. counting for vacant properties sometimes involves doing some field work. And this is, again, a kind of thing that it's really useful to have sort of an internal dialogue with, and how you deal with this can kind of depend on the level of technology you have. One of the systems we dealt with in Arizona here recently, they've got they're a larger system, but they've got a GIS map of their system, and then they've got the billing system, and they've actually got it set up so that they do a nightly reconciliation of physical meters that have been placed out in the field from their GIS department with their billing department, and if anything doesn't match, it gets flagged so that they can go check whether there's something awry. You know, the easiest thing I think to do is look at maps, that if you have them, you know, look at accounts, but ultimately it may come down to some footwork, you know, doing that field verification of systems that are out there. And again, if you've got properties that might be vacant but might not be, you know, stock meter reports and low use reports can be really useful. One of the systems I was working with in Florida is a vacation home system, and they run into this issue a lot because they have, you know, very flexible occupancy. In the summertime, it's really busy. In the wintertime, there's not that many people. So they have houses that are, you know, not active quite a lot. Another thing you might want to do is you can let your customers know that, you know, if they're moving out or the house is going to be vacant, to shut off service. You know, a lot of times that kind of doesn't happen, particularly in rental properties. People just leave, and the connection is still there. So a lot of different ways to answer that, but ultimately I think it's probably going to come down to a little bit of footwork. Is there anything else in here?
Nope, I think we've covered it all. So I think we're in good shape. Lots of people have hung around extra for us, so we appreciate your time. And if you have any additional questions, make sure you reach out to us via email. And then Avery, we can turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Don and James, for presenting with us today and throughout the series. Following this webinar, all attendees from today will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. We ask that you let us, and automatically our evaluation will pop up after the webinar. So we do ask that you complete that, as it lets us know your thoughts on today's session and helps us plan future webinars that on topics that matter to you. So thank you again for your continued engagement throughout this series, and we hope to see you in the future.